So I'm just going to start with something that it's attributable to Mark Twain. I'm going with the fact that it's probably them because Mark Twain Society has adopted it. But what he was getting at is that weather is variable, very variable on a short time scale, you know, a couple of days out to a couple of weeks. And climate is very much something that's averages over a longer period. It's, you know, we usually use some sort of 30-year period to get an idea. But it's, again, that's variable over seasons, over years and decades. And you can see that here. There's three different, it's from the IPCC most recent report. And there's three different lines there, which are just three different assessments of temperature measurements for the global, anomalies for the global mean temperature. But what you can see, apart from the trend that we are all aware of, is massive variability from year to year, as well as a sort of longer cycles maybe over periods of decades. So there's this inherent volatility that we're dealing with on a regular basis and uncertainty in that. Okay, slightly out of order, so I'll just run with this. And what we're most concerned about, what I mostly deal with, is high impact weather. You know, that's the bits that we're most exposed to, that we're most vulnerable from, is all of these, the floods, the tornadoes, the ice storms. They're the things that are the least predictable. We can get used to changes in the averages over time. You know, human nature is pretty good at doing that. And what we know from Munich Re and from various other reinsurance industry reports and all sorts of scientific reports is that there's an increase in the frequency of events that are happening. And what you'll see here, what you'll see is these are geophysical hazards, so that's your earthquakes. There's really not been much change, which is good. But what we have here are floods, climate events, so droughts and heat waves, and windstorms, hurricanes, tropical cyclones. And there's been virtually a threefold increase since 1980. And some of that is due to the way that this is measured, that the numbers basically dependent on who is exposed, how this is measured. So some of that is to do with the fact that we're all living in more exposed areas, but a lot of that is to do with frequency. So what do we do about that? Well, I'd just like to go back a little bit to risk. If I told you that there was a 30% chance of it raining today, would you go out without your umbrella? Or for those who, you know, I'm British, so I always go out with an umbrella. If I told you that there was a 30% chance that there was going to be really good snow, would you have left your snowboard or skis behind? Probably not. You'd have taken the chance. So why, when we talk about the 1 in 100 year event, do we forget that there is a 30% chance that that is going to happen in the life of your mortgage? I don't like that risk, because 1 in 100 is only a 1% chance per year. And we really, really need to start changing the communication of this fairly important statistic. And if I don't achieve anything else today, I'd love it if all of you would go away and stop talking about the 1 in 100 year event. And the other thing is, there's 13% chance that that'll happen twice. Great. So we're going to get 2013 all over again. Hopefully not. So really, when we're talking about what we do, how we manage risks and volatility, we need to understand what a realistic tolerance for risk is. What are you prepared to put up with? Maybe you don't mind it if you've got a chance of your house flooding once during your mortgage. Maybe you're planning on moving out anyway. It doesn't matter. But some people are. Maybe we need to start to factor that into our decision processes. So, and the big problem with that is, this is sorry, my mind has gone blank and I cannot think of what you call it in American English. This is a flood defense embankment. It's, you know, the way that we deal with all of these hazards is we try and keep them out. We build ever higher embankments and walls, and then people come and live behind them. And they're like, well, it's fine, isn't it? It's not going to flood for 100 years because I've got a wall there. And then it fails. And we're not very good at managing that fact that we knew that this was inevitable. It was likely to fail. What should we do about that instead? Because resistance is not resilience. And as things are getting more and more frequent, and as we're living more and more in vulnerable and exposed areas, we just can't afford to carry on doing things the same way, regardless of whether we think that that's actually a sensible way of going about it or sustainable. You know, I'd go back to what Brett was saying yesterday, but this resilience and sustainability are kind of, you've got to merge the two. They're two. At the moment, we think of them in two separate groups. So he mentioned Holling's work yesterday on ecological resilience. And this whole cycle, growth, I'll explain it from the perspective of the ecology. You start in the growth phase, and that's basically, you've got some barren land that gets colonized. The weeds come in, the quick-growing trees, and then gradually over time, they start to come together, they start to cluster, they start to become connected, and they get into the conservation phase. They become a woodland, they become pasture, they become a habitat, and that becomes great. And then something comes through, a natural phenomenon that happens regularly, a wildfire, say. And so that all falls apart and it releases. And then the whole thing goes through again. It all reorganizes, and then the weeds come in and the trees. And while that stays in that cycle, that's resilient. That's ecological resilience. When something happens that tips it over the edge and puts it into a different loop, that's when you have failures. But the problem is that engineering resilience sits up here, and it assumes that we're just going to stay in that static little environment. But we can't really do that. To be able to achieve that, we have to have volatility of a certain amount, naturally. We have to have redundancy. We have to behave a little bit more like an ecological system. And so that redundancy is learning to accept our levels of risk a little bit and dealing with the inevitability of failure a bit differently. Because, like I just pointed out, failure isn't if, but when. And graceful failure is something that has been around for a very long time. Structural engineers have been using this concept in seismic design. Buildings that are built out of wood, when they start to fail, it gives you some warning as a person that you've got to get out. But also you design the building so that when it does fail, people aren't trapped in there, that they can get out. So we need to start thinking about how do we make safe access, safe egress for people? How do we make sure that the things that are most important are protected and that everything else we can kind of clean up afterwards? And that allows for some of that inevitable uncertainty. Because if you've only got 30 years of records, if you're lucky, maybe 100, even with all the best extreme value theory in the world, you still got this massive uncertainty estimating what's going to happen. Is that really a 1 in 100 year event? Or, is that something a lot more frequent? So it takes account of a little bit of that. It takes account a little bit of worrying about what other emission scenarios you might want to consider. And you fail at an acceptable level. That can be different. My basement, maybe I can deal with that flooding, but you don't want the hospital to flood. You don't want the massive highways and the power stations to go out, because that knocks out so many other cascading events. The water and the sewerage. So I'll just give you a quick visual of what exactly graceful failure is. You have a glass, and you have an aluminium can, and you attack them both with a hammer. Which one's going to be still functioning? Well, it doesn't look very pretty, but at least the aluminium can still hold water. So it's something that we can recover from. And Boulder's pretty good, actually. There's been things said, there's a lot that people said could be done differently, could be done better. But within the city of Boulder, actually, they've taken a lot of steps towards resilience, and they manage the floods pretty well. All of those cycleways and the green park areas behind my house, and the underground car park areas. I know people lost some cars in the car parks, but better their cars than themselves. And it made space for the rivers. It meant that it was cleaned up a lot quicker and people were back on their feet again. It was a lot more resilient. And so I'm going to go back to uncertainty. And, you start with your idea of what population growth is going to be, and you pick your emissions scenario. Are we going to carry on as we currently are, throwing out all this carbon? Which is your favorite climate model of the day? Run it through that. And you carry on and you add in your statistical uncertainty. And the way that we do decisions right now, we just add uncertainty at each layer. And then finally we get down to the decision makers. And maybe we should start from the bottom. Maybe we should start from those decisions and work backwards and kick out some of that uncertainty. But you can only really do that if you've got a full collaborative effort going on. You have to talk to everybody. You have to talk to the people who are affected by the decisions. And you have to bring everybody into the room, the people who are making the decisions, the people who are impacted by regulations, the people who are creating the data. Scientists are terrible, I've had this from both sides. I worked as an engineer, and I was told by on high, you're going to have to use this data, but we're not sure about it. And this is what the regulations tell you because this is your professional indemnity insurance, so that's that. And you're stuck in a rock and a hard place. And then I now work as a scientist, and I'm occasionally guilty of that. Well, I've got some beautiful data for you. Why don't you use my pictures, please? But it doesn't help. It's not the decisions that people want to make. And by doing that, by understanding what different people's risk tolerances are, what the decisions are that they're making, and bringing everybody together in one room, then you start to get more resilient because you start to understand what the nuances are. And that's where the Engineering for Climate Extremes Partnership comes in. This is essentially me opening my big mouth. I went into my boss's office and I said, you know what we don't do? We don't talk to engineers. And he went, okay then, you do that. So 3 years later, it's suddenly grown phenomenally, beyond anything that I ever imagined. But the idea is that we bring all of those people together. It's a collaboration between local government decision makers and federal government and indigenous communities and businesses and engineers and insurance and academia. And it's really about that decision space. But some of the people that were missing, we just had a workshop back in August, and some of the people who were really missing were the big data managers. To me, big data was what I dealt with during my PhD, which was about 200 rainfall stations, which was a lot for me, but it really isn't much big data. So those people, the computer scientists and communication specialists, we have some great social scientists in our team, but there weren't enough of those people there. So we had a broad range of decision makers, but not of the other people. And it's about reducing the catastrophic impacts in changing the way that we give you the data to make the decisions. And what we're trying to do is develop the tools that you need to do that. So the Global Risk Resilience and Impacts Toolbox is essentially that. It's fully open source and hosted by NCAR. And although it's initially developed by NCAR and the partners within ESEP, it will eventually be developed by the community as well, in the way that all of the best community models are that are developed in NCAR, the community climate models. It goes out there, it's downloadable off the web, and you can use it yourself or you can contribute to it. We'll be running tutorials and workshops to help people understand. And the absolute simplistic way of describing it is it's a database with all of that vulnerability and hazard and risk and exposure. And then it's a framework that brings it together, that pings out to pick up data that we aren't hosting, that's available elsewhere, that does all of the calculations for you, and then has a front end with decision-making tools. Think about it as something like an app on your iPhone. You don't need to know any of the rest of the stuff that goes in there that makes that work. What you know is you can go on there and you can click on the NOAA weather app and you can estimate what your chances of rainfall are today. So we have a series of different tools that we're working with. This particular one is with the construction industry, understanding what would close them down during their construction period, what's important to them. And I presented one of them yesterday as well. And I'm just going to leave you with this. We have a website. We'd love to hear from you. You can go on there, you can sign up for our newsletter. We have blogs and we have discussion forum. We'd love to have a blog from you if you've got something, a hobby horse that you want to get on. We were recently in the UCAR Atmos news, but also yesterday where we featured in the Daily Camera. There was a big section on the UR Boulder bit, and we managed to get a little bit in there on us too. And a date for your diary is our next workshop is next July, the 6th of July, so please come along. If you sign up for the news list, then we can make sure that you get all of the information. And otherwise, I'd love to talk to you. So thank you.